Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be talking about my most disappointing and probably worst books of 2024. Most of these I would just say were disappointing in like execution, but there is probably about two of them at least that I know for sure I would consider like the worst books that I read because of reasons. And when I get to them, you'll find out. So let's go ahead and let's jump right on into this. So first up on this list is A Home in the Sky by Olivia Snow. This is a middle grade book. It is a retelling of Jack and the Beanstalk and probably one of the worst retellings I've ever come across. I understand that in like a lot of middle grade books, they like to have parents where you can tell like, oh, that's a really bad parent. This was like to the extreme. The mother felt it was necessary to tell her 10-year-old, like he was either 10 or 12. He was in that age range because it's middle grade. But to tell her child that he needs to get a job to help pay off the debt that she created. To the point to where like she tells him to get a job. He has a job as like a newsboy, going around throwing newspapers at people's doors. And she tells him to sell his bike. And he's like, but I need the bike to do the job. And she's like, well, you need to get a real job. And I'm like, he's like 10, 12 at the most. Where is he going to get a job? Like, you're the adult. Then it does the whole Jack and the Beanstalk thing. He gets the beans and ends up creating the beanstalk, and he gets up into the sky, into the giant's home and stuff. And it ends up wrapping up in the end where the mother doesn't apologize for how she treated him. She doesn't like change her tune or anything. It turns into this like millionaire modern kind of thing. Like a lot of the choices that were made were just not interesting and just not something that I would be like, yeah, I totally think a kid would enjoy this. It just rubbed me the wrong way in just so many ways. Just not very good. And I attempted to read a couple of her other like more modern retellings and none of them are good. So that's just an author I'm just not gonna like bother with anymore. After that, I have the classic The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. So there's a lot of classics I have never read, and I went through, I think it was like 2, maybe 3 years ago, looking up a bunch of classics and deciding like which ones I did want to check out. Most of them are children's classics because I have a bigger interest in those than I do a lot of the adult classics, and The Phantom Tollbooth was one. My written review for this, I put down, sometimes I think I pick out books because I hate myself. I just remember initially starting out thinking it was cute, it was interesting. Kid finds this toll booth, it takes him to this alternate like little universe and he starts to travel around in it. But after a while, it just felt like it started to drag on and on and on. The writing style was really like boring. Like, I don't really know how to like say it. Like, it wasn't like an interesting writing style that kept you entertained and engrossed. And then when it finally got to the chapter where it was literally an entire chapter about math, I was like, this is not the book for me. I hate this. Why is there an entire chapter about math? As a certified math hater, I hated that. So yeah, ended up just not enjoying it. And I even did it with an audiobook, which did not help either. Next up, we have Loot by Jennifer Thorne. So this was a library pick that I randomly grabbed when I was at the library one day because it sounded pretty interesting. Like it was like this cult and this woman gets wrapped up in it and it all takes place on this island with this, event that happens like all the time, a reoccurring event or whatever. And I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. One of my first turnoffs was the fact that the first 3 chapters were unnecessarily long. It was 35% of the book. 3 chapters was 35% of the book. And a lot of it was repetitive information just being told to me over and over again, just in a different way, in a different chapter. And I was like, okay, like, can we move on with the story? And then when the horror aspect started to like pop up in the story, it was basically like, oh, there's these tragedies are happening where these people are dying and it's like a set amount of people per a set amount of days. But we don't get to like see all of them. Some of them were happening like off screen. Some happened where it was kind of like a series would happen, like a couple days would be like condensed down. But the biggest issue I had was that like there was no really build up to these deaths. There was no build up to these moments. Instead, it was like Thorne was attempting to do shock factor, and I think that really ended up ruining the experience, because like you're going along fine and then all of a sudden someone's dead, and I was like, okay, like what? And the thing was, is like, even as shock value, it wasn't hitting the right way to give you that, oh my god, this is so shocking and horrible and scary. And then the biggest disappointment was the ending. It was so incredibly anticlimactic. Like, you spend all this time building up, and you're just like, how are we going to come back from what's happening? How are we going to stop what's happening? And she picks like the easiest way out, and I was just like, that was anticlimactic. That was kind of rude. So that's why that one ended up on the list. Just overall, an entirely anticlimactic story. Next, we have Shadow by Anne Logston. So I spent 2 years trying to find this book, because I have book 2 and I have book 4. I found book 2 first, initially thinking it was like a book 1, because a lot of these older series don't tell you if they're part of a series or not. So I spent the 2 years finding it, finally found it, and was like, yay. So read it, and this was so disappointing. To have spent 2 years looking for it and to be disappointed by it is just not a fun feeling. So essentially, you follow Shadow. She's this little elf girl who is apparently like the greatest thief that's kind of ever lived, and it's a world with humans and elves and all these other, magical creatures and whatnot. And for the most part, it feels like there's no plot in this book. You're just watching this girl go around this kingdom that she's currently in, sleeping with men. And I like the fact that the author was like, here's my female character who is very comfortable in her not provocativeness, that's not the word I wanted, in her sexuality, that she is willing and wanting to just sleep with whatever men she finds attractive, because that's not like a common character arc and trait that we see for female characters. So I did appreciate the author giving us that kind of character. The problem was like that's pretty much like all it focused on for a good majority of this book, and as you can see, it's pretty small. I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's under 200 pages. It is around 180 pages. So that became more of an annoyance than anything. And then with her constantly telling us, she's the greatest thief, she's the greatest thief, she's a great thief, blah, 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 blah. I was like, okay, well, can you show me some thieving? Can I see the thieving? When are we going to do the thieving? Like, one of my biggest pet peeves is when authors just tell me a character is good at something, but never actually takes the time to show me them being good at it. So when she did finally show us a scene of her stealing something, she dragged it out for pages. It got to the point where I was just like, I don't even care if you steal this item or not, because this should not be taking 9 pages. Why are we dragging this out? It was unnecessary. And then she ends up trying to like squeeze in this plot about a bracelet that she ends up getting and how it's super important and it's in the wrong hands and the bad people are trying to get it. But it just felt so like kind of like afterthought added in, that it didn't stand out or anything. So unfortunately, it just ended up being like this huge disappointment. I haven't decided if I'm going to read book 2 yet. I do still have it, and it's just as long. So even if I do, it shouldn't take long, but I'm just not sure if I'm going to or not. Next, we have Seed by Anaya Alberg. Yeah. So this was a book that my baby sister, had actually pointed out to me about 2 years ago. She found it on Instagram. It's a horror book. My baby sister is super into horror. And she was looking for it. She was looking for a specific edition. I finally found it, and I was like, hey, I found it. I'm going to read it before I send it to you, though. So I did. And overall, like, the idea sounds really interesting, because like when you read the synopsis, it talks about it being child possession of like a demon taking over a child, and I was like, ooh, I love books like that. Like I like demon possession books where a child is the one being taken over. I don't know why, I just do, guys, don't question me. And it was so lackluster in its delivery of the demon possession that it made it frustrating to read, because the story is actually more so about the father and his struggle of recognizing the fact that his kid is being possessed by a demon because he also went through the same thing. You learn that in the first 2 pages, so it's not really a spoiler, and it's also alluded to in the synopsis, but the story focuses more so on the father and like his choices and how he handles the fact that his child is being possessed. And he becomes extremely frustrating because you're just like, can you do something, sir? Can you tell someone? Can you talk to someone? Can you communicate like with your wife? You know, and it's just like more so his internal turmoil over what's going on, and then trying to like discover why it happened to him and why it's happening now. And then the moments of like the demon possession were so far and few between, and it was like simple things like the table flipped over, the walls were rattling, there was banging on the walls, and I was like, this doesn't even sound like the child is possessed. Like, for the most part of the story, the child doesn't even, like, the child's attitude changes, and you're kind of like, wow, like, the child's attitude is kind of funky. But like, for anything supernatural happening and scary, it was just like the surrounding area. And it's not until the end that the child does something completely and totally out of character that is more in line with like being possessed by this demon, and it takes place off page. It takes place off page, and you walk into, and like you follow the father walking into the scene, and you're just like, you finally do something and you're not even gonna show me. And it was so disappointing. And I would also like to take a moment to point out that there is 2 types of animal deaths in this book. There is a dog death and a cat death. And to all the reviewers online that are only mad about the dog, you're messed up, okay? All animals, okay? We should be upset about all animals dying in these books. I don't understand why we have dogs on such a pedestal, but I was enraged over the cat, and I was mad about the dog, okay? But I'm also a cat person. But I just want to say, if anybody who is looking to read this book, because it maybe following the father's trauma sounds more interesting than the child possession aspect, just know that there are 2 animal deaths, and it is a dog and a cat. That way you have your trigger warnings. You're welcome. Next up, we have Darkness There. This is a short story collection for Edgar Allan Poe. It was released through Amazon through their Prime subscription, and it's an interactive book. And I have never actually read Edgar Allan Poe. I know of his poem, The Raven, specifically like a particular stance, because you see it on blankets and pillows and posters and, you know, all of that stuff. But as for the entire Raven poem, I never really read it in its entirety, but I do know of it. And then it had 3 other of his short stories. I wouldn't even really consider one of them to be short because, oh my God, did it drag on forever. But I realized I am not a fan of Edgar Allan Poe or his writing. That, like, specifically his writing, I am not a fan of it. I think when he writes his actual poems, those are good. They're good. Some of them are questionable about the content that are in them, but the poems are, they're interesting to read, okay? Whereas his storytelling, like when he writes a story, absolutely loathe it, do not like it. I struggled so hard. There was the one, I don't remember the name of it, but it was the one about the lady who, she gets murdered and stuff like in the chimney and the wall. I believe they did a TV show recently that kind of like incorporated that one. As you can see, I'm not a hardcore Edgar Allan Poe fan, but that one in particular was the one I had the worst experience with because I just felt like it kept dragging while not like really going anywhere. But in general, it was just his writing style for his stories. And I was just like, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. And I honestly will be totally fine never reading anything by Edgar Allan Poe again. And I'm okay with that. Next, we have Marked for Mayhem by Susan Hayes. So this is a romance book. This is number 2 in a series. I had read number 1 in the December before January of last year. So in December of 2023, I read the first book. And then in January of 2024, I read this one. And this was extremely disappointing. I already struggle with a lot of romance books because I feel the romance is missing from romance books. And I also feel like a lot of romance books are being mismarketed when in reality, a lot of these romance books are erotica. And this is one of them. This should have been marketed as erotica. The thing that disappointed me more, though, was that the first book felt more like a romance book, and it also set up this plot that should have been overarching through the entire series. And I was looking forward to that because I like when a romance series that has multiple installments in it has an overarching story, and the first one set one up. The second book did not touch that at all, didn't reference it, didn't talk about it, did nothing with it at all. The characters have zero chemistry with each other. They met each other, and within like an hour of like in time storytelling, they were already banging. And I was like, you guys literally just met. Like, what are we doing right now? And then the story just became about them just constantly banging. And I was just like, this isn't what I signed up for. Like, where's the story? Where's the plot? Where's all the issues that are at hand? Like, how are we addressing that? Like, we're completely skipping over it. And then the epilogue has like this like 2-3 year time skip thing, and there's children, and I'm like, what is happening right now? And it just completely ruined the appeal of the entire series for me, because from book 1 to book 2, they were just completely in two different realms, and I don't understand how that ended up being possible. Next, we have The Crystal Cave by Mary Stewart. This was such a huge disappointment and letdown. As a huge Arthurian fan, one of the book series that people have told me that I just have to read because it's one of the best Arthurian retellings out there is Mary Stewart's Arthurian Saga. So, of course, like any person who's crazy about books, I guess, I bought majority of the series. I think I'm missing just the last one. And I was prepared to like fall in love with this series because everybody is just like, it's so great, it's so amazing, it's this, it's that, it's the best you'll ever read. It's usually like whenever you watch like the best Arthurian retellings ever, it's always in like the top like 5. And I was so disappointed because where is this the best? This first installment was, for lack of a better words, the most boring thing to try and get through. It dragged, it was slow, it split up in 5 parts, and only part 2 was actually the most interesting. Everything else was just kind of like, okay, where's the interesting parts come in? And a lot of it has to do with the style of how the story is presented. It reads like a textbook. Because unfortunately, the story is from Merlin's perspective, and this is one of my least favorite perspectives, is like that first person perspective, because it's very limited in what can be done with it, because the character isn't like, there's not like this omniscient voice in the background telling you every little detail, and I love all the details. I want to be a fly on the wall. And so much of the story is just Merlin relaying information to me how he heard it, but like in a textbook manner. Like he'd be like, we went to war, and then someone died at war, and then we went to this other place for war, and then this other thing happened, and it just read like a textbook. Like, and it just made it really hard to stay engrossed and entertained in this story. And then I wasn't really a fan of the personality that Merlin had been portrayed with in this particular take. I noticed with the amount of different Arthurian books that I've read, Merlin is one of the most inconsistent personality types across like all of them. And it's very odd to me, but I have to say this particular one is probably my least favorite that I've come across. I just didn't really care for it, especially with how he treated a lot of the female characters in the story. Definitely wasn't a big fan of the way the female characters were treated as well. And just overall, it was disappointing. And I buddy read this with Chaz over at Bookish Chaz, and he also ended up not being a fan of it. And we both ended up just having a lot of issues, and a lot of the problems I had, he also had, and a lot of the problems he had, I had. And after we were done, we were both kind of like, do we even want to continue? Like, And we're still kind of up in arms about that. The last we talked, it was kind of like, I guess we'll see what happens. So yeah, super, super disappointing. If you love it, I'm glad. But unfortunately for me, it's not a very good Arthurian, like, at least the first book. It wasn't good. I'm sorry. Our next one is The Witch Queen of Halloween by Kresley Cole. My first issue with this is that title. The title gives middle grade vibes. The Witch Queen of Halloween. Like, it sounds like something you would find in a middle grade book. And this is coming from someone who reads and owns middle grade books. And not only that, it throws off the vibe of the rest of the titles of the series, because this is like 18.1 or 18.5 for the Immortals After Dark series. And so the title clashes with everything else that she's done for this series. So that was like, it's a small thing, but it's an annoyance. But upon reading the book, first, the book was delayed because she didn't feel like she got the ending correct. And honestly, the entire thing was bad. Not just the ending, the entire thing was bad. One of the biggest things that stood out to me most and my friend, because we buddy read this together, is something's wrong with the writing style. When you read an author and you read 18 books by said author, you start to follow their writing style and you start to expect certain things because they've established it for 18 books. That's how they write this story. None of those normal consistencies that you would find in her stories are present in The Witch Queen of Halloween. The way she was presenting certain characters that have been through in her series for all 18 books were not acting how they've acted normally. She was not portraying certain sound effects the way she normally has. It just felt very cheesy, very cheaply done, and almost as if somebody else wrote this story. Like, and I don't like to say that because it's a rude assumption to be like, you had a ghostwriter, you didn't write this, but that's what it feels like. Like, this feels like she had somebody else write this story because none of it felt like how she writes her stories. One of the other biggest things that makes me feel like something happened here with writing this story is her characters have zero chemistry, and she is fantastic at chemistry. All of her previous books, even if I do not like the characters, their chemistry is amazing and their character building is fantastic. She is great at this, and she's great at plot building. Like, her fantasy plot building is insane. And I have said for years that if she was to ever move away from romance and just do like a straight fantasy world, she would be a really good contender because her world building is actually really, really good, and a lot of thought and work and effort goes into it. This felt like a half job done portion of this world. Like, I don't know what happened here. And then with the characters not having their chemistry, not feeling like these two were actually interested in each other, it just made it so lackluster and frustrating because I know she's better than this. And then to top it off, she had said that this was supposed to be her love letter to the horror genre because she loves horror. Now, when you read earlier, like the Immortals After Darks 1 through 18, like, the horror is there. She has some very horrific things happen to some of her characters. The book McReeve, the things that guy goes through are horrific. She has this whole arc around this island where the paranormal people, because there's like vampires, werewolves, witches, things like that in her world, they're getting kidnapped, cut open, and experimented on. And it's horrific. And this book, The Witch Queen of Halloween, felt like she was making fun of her own horror aspects, and not so much as being a love letter to the horror genre that she claims it to be. And that was so incredibly frustrating because she can do horror. She can do horrific and scary and all of that kind of stuff that you would like expect from like a horror genre, just meshed into her romance and fantasy world. And so I was just like, I feel like you're making fun of it than you are actually making this a love letter. And then to top it off, like, I didn't care for the characters themselves. And that sucks because Rock is a character who appeared in an earlier book who I really liked. And I was like, you know what? You could have just kept this in the drafts. You could have just kept it in the drafts, or instead of making it a novella, just make it a full story so that everything could be there. But the thing is she can write a novella. So I don't know what happened here. It felt more like a Kindle Unlimited, I wrote this in a week, have a fantasy romance book. That's what this felt like, and it was just so utterly disappointing. And so I really hope when her next one, Cosmina, comes out, that we go back to what we're used to. But I am a little on the fence because this was just so out of pocketly bad for her that I was like, what is happening here? So yeah. Moving on. And the last book on this list is The Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Wise. I hope I got those names correctly said. This is the worst book of the year for me. This was an absolute slog. I hated every single moment that I was reading this book. And I know you're probably sitting here thinking, well, why didn't you just DNF it? Believe me, I wanted to, guys. I wanted to. But according to all of the Dragonlance fans, I have to read it. I have to. Because in reality, I was technically only interested in The Tale of the Twins, which is a trilogy about the twins that do appear in The Dragons of Autumn Twilight. And I had initially only bought the twin trilogy. And I remember posting about it, saying how I wanted to read it. And a lot of people were like, oh, well, did you read the first trilogy? And I was like, no. And they're like, well, you have to. And I was like, okay. So I ended up buying those books. And when I started this one, and immediately within 6-7 chapters, I was hating it. I did not like any of the characters. I didn't care for the writing style. I didn't care for how the events were unfolding. That I remember making a post on Twitter and was like, do I have to read this before I read The Tale of the Twins? Because honestly, that's all I want to read. And I got responses like, well, if you skip this trilogy, you're going to have to infer what happens when you start the next trilogy. And I was like, okay, I don't understand why you have to sound kind of condescending about that, but okay. And I was like, but like, seriously, like, how much am I actually missing? And they're like, well, they're connected, so you have to. And I was just like, whatever, fine. Okay, since everyone is saying I just have to. And they're like, it gets better as you go along. It's a little rough in the beginning, but it gets better. It never got better, ever, at all. Everyone kept saying like the second half of the book was so much better. It was not. It was actually worse. Like it got worse when I got to the second half because we got some really weird relationship things going on with some of the male characters and the female characters. A lot of very uncomfortable portrayals, you know what I mean? Like the girls are so young and the guys are kind of older that it gives kind of like weird pedo vibes. But overall, like, because I do still plan on doing a video about it, so I don't want to just talk about everything and dump everything here, but like it was just, I didn't like the characters, I didn't like the events, I didn't like the ending with the relationships and everything. Just overall, like it was such a pain to get through, and I was not enjoying it. And now that I am like done with it, by the time I finished it, I was like, I don't even want to read The Tale of the Twins anymore. Like I genuinely don't. And so I don't know if I'm going to continue this series or not. It's looking like I'm not going to. I'm going to be honest. It's definitely leaning towards I'm not going to finish this series just because my experience with this one was so bad. But we'll see. We shall see what 2025 brings. So that's everything that disappointed me or was considered the worst reads for 2024. If there's anything on here that you read and you enjoyed, I'd like to hear why you enjoyed it. If you also hated it, I would like to hear why you also hated it or disliked it. We can also use that word too. I know hate is a strong word. So yeah, like, subscribe, comment, all of those great things, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.